for your time this evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to give you a treat talking about mountain hares in the Peak District and how data, citizen science data, including that for Cheshire Local Record Centre, has contributed to some international studies of mountain hares. This work was conducted through Manchester Metropolitan University, sponsored by People's Trust for Endangered Species, Hare Preservation Trust, and also supported by Queen's University Belfast, and of course your good selves. Okay, so next slide I'm trying to get to, bear with me, here we are. You can see that with the arrows. Someone give me a nod. Yep, great. So we're going to talk about four things. Some ecology background about mountain hares for a few minutes, and then I'll open it for two questions, just if there's ecology questions. Then we're going to go into what is called the ecological niche model using the citizen science data, and that's a long section which will take a good 30 minutes at least, and it becomes quite technical and quite fun. Then we'll have another pause for a couple of minutes and open a couple of questions. And then we'll talk about abundance and finally conservation status. So that should take us in total roughly 50 minutes, 50 to 60 minutes. Okay, so background. Mountain hares. As we know, they are this lovely brown furry creature in summer, this lovely hare creature. And as we know, in winter, they turn white, and this fact that they eat snow to turn themselves white, it was first identified by that famous natural historian and Roman naval sea commander Pliny the Elder in AD 79. He saw the mountain hares eating snow and turning white. And that's why we love them, because they're so beautiful. Now, of course, we do know a little bit more these days, and that actually the reason they turn white in November, December is something about day length and air temperature. So it's something different than what Pliny the Elder thought. So we have what is a lagomorph. It's a hare-shaped creature. It has peg teeth, so two front teeth that are useful for browsing and grazing. So they will eat grass, heather, also tree bark, berries and shrubs. They are what is called coprophages, which means they eat their food and they don't really digest it very well because it's tough vegetable matter. And so they poo it, and then they eat it. They eat their own poo. And if you're lucky, depending, you might see a hare with its head sat between its legs, eating its own poo. And then that poo, it sits, that vegetable matter, it sits in a special chamber called the cecum, where it digests, out it comes, and therefore they have two lots of eating, and that's where they get their nutrients. That's hares and lagomorphs. So, of course, like bunnies, like rabbits, they're prolific breeders. So they have several litters per year. They're capable of this amazing act of superfoetation, which means that she can be pregnant, and then a male hare comes along and he says, "She looks really nice. I'm going to get her pregnant again." And so she can be carrying two litters at the same time. So they're very prolific. Mountain hares are cold adapted. They're an Arctic species that are sister species to the Arctic hare and the North American snowshoe hare. So they've got these white coats, which we're describing. They're white because what happens in the autumn is that the hair follicle stops producing brown melanin pigment. So the hair becomes hollow with no pigment, and that makes it insulative. And so that means a mountain hare can survive at temperatures outside down to about minus 30 degrees Celsius. Also, because their coat is white, it provides them with protection from predators when it's snowy. And as predator avoiders, they've got eyes either side of the head. They can sort of see 360 degrees. And if something does come, and they've got these huge ears, so they can hear you coming from like 200 meters. If they hear you coming from standstill, they can move at like in 2 seconds up to 40 miles an hour. So they can accelerate faster than a Ferrari. Amazing creatures. So mountain hares in Britain. Well, we had this extinction. This is detailed in a paper by Thulin from Sweden, where he talks about mountain hares and brown hares, and he shows where the ice pack was. And essentially, and people ask me this, they say, oh, why did mountain hares die out during the ice age? You don't know what you're talking about. They're an Arctic creature. But what actually happened was, as this ice retreated north into Scotland from England, the mountain hares, we think, followed the ice. And so where we've got bones of mountain hares in caves in Derbyshire from 6,000 years ago, that's the last sort of fossil record. After that, there were no mountain hares. They disappeared from England. So the map on the right, it shows the present distribution of mountain hares. You can see them in Scotland and Ireland. And then there's this tiny little dot, which is the Peak District, which is very interesting because they weren't there 6,000 years ago. So what we think has happened is a couple of things. First of all, in Scotland, there were mountain hares throughout these past few thousand years, but it seems they were at low densities. And the lady Ruth Hamill in Ireland, in Dublin, she conducted genetic analysis and showed that in Scotland there was a population bottleneck, maybe about 1,500 years ago. So we think the populations were generally very low densities, 1 to 4 hares per square kilometre. And that's certainly what we see in Western Scotland. But in Eastern Scotland, for example, in the Cairngorms, they introduced this practice of muir burn, which is rotational heather burning. So here the heather is burned into patches, and this provides different succession stages or heights of heather, which is favorable for red grouse, the bird that likes to sit in the heather and nest, and also peck at heather at head height after it's grown to about 10 years old. So it's sort of head height. So that practice is conducted for red grouse for shooting, but it's also beneficial to mountain hares, who particularly like these patches, the new patches, where pioneer heather grows through. And after a couple of years, it's just young shoots growing through the ground. It's soft and tasty. And that encourages mountain hare populations. So now in Scotland, we have seen densities up to 200 mountain hares per square kilometre, courtesy of that practice of burning heather, muir burn. So those are the hares in Scotland. What we also have is in England, we had some reintroduction. So here we had mountain hares reintroduced in the 1870s across England and Wales. Most of them died out, shot out. Those in the Peak District survived here. We had a nice study from Phil Wheeler in 2001, and this sort of mapped them, sort of broad brush strokes. And then we have also a very noble citizen science effort from Sorby Natural History Society. They go out every last Sunday of March each year and do a sort of rough and ready count around Derwent edges. And so that's given an idea of population cyclicity that you can see here of a rise and fall in numbers. It's sort of an undisciplined effort, but it gives a kind of impression.
So overall, we had for 40 or 50 years, very little idea of how many mountain hares there were in the Peak District and where they might be. And so Derek Yolden, the professor from University of Manchester, he conducted studies previously, and then Dave Mallon and Phil Wheeler. And there's a large jump in Phil Wheeler's estimates because of some very generous statistical treatment. But from the times that I was walking over Bleaklow, 2003 onwards, people would say to me, and it was almost, they silently sort of agreed the same term, mountain hares, they're in decline, aren't they? And gamekeepers would say this, rangers would say this, fell runners would say this, people would say mountain hares are in decline. So there's this question, comes 2017, of where are the mountain hares and how many are there? And that's how these studies arose. Okay, so bar from that technical break, and I apologize, that's the first section, which is about ecology in the Peak District. And now we're going to talk about the ecological niche model of mountain hares, which is quite a mouthful. What does this mean? So this beautiful book on the left, it's not even called ecological niche model, it's called Habitat Suitability and Distribution Models. It's written by these Swiss scientists, and it's the most beautiful book on species and where they live that I've ever read. The first 8 chapters are amazing. The rest of it is technical statistics and very hard going. But what it describes is, in the main, these theories which say, where are animals? So it talks about the fundamental niche, which is where the animal or the plant could be based on its energy requirements, so warmth from the sun and some moisture. And this is typically done at a continental or a regional scale. So it's like, what are the physiological characteristics that allow that plant or animal to exist? Then we have what is called the realized niche. And this is, well, what are the animals eating? What do they shelter in? So what is their sort of source of nutrients and their sort of warmth and safety? So where does it really live? And how is that constrained by competition with other creatures? So other herbivores or predators, or typically human activities, such as building roads and towns, or saying, let's get rid of this jungle and put in some palm oil plantations instead. So the realized niche is a much constrained sort of area. It's an expression of where the species is. So that's what we were trying to answer for mountain hares. And these terms are also known as species distribution models or habitat suitability models. So they ask the same questions from slightly different perspectives. So we prepared a paper using citizen science data called Splitting Hares, which basically says, after climate change in 30 years' time, what's going to happen with mountain hares in the Peak District, and what will happen with brown hares? So brown hares, they're a sort of a different critter. It's the European brown hare, Lepus europaeus. Now these migrated from the steppes of Central Asia, which is also a nice tune by Borodin. And so these European brown hares migrated through the Balkans, through Italy 12,000 years ago, again following the ice, and crossed the whole of Europe. They seem to have come into England, brought by sort of Neolithic man or the Romans. And so they're a slightly different creature. They're a sister creature. They've got longer ears and a longer face. And they also eat sort of grassy or woody material. Their coat does not change to white in the winter, so it stays brown. So they are a competitor to the mountain hare. So let's just orient ourselves a little bit. We have the Peak District in the sort of centre of northern England. And then we have sort of, so it's here, we've got these uplands, we've got the cities of Sheffield on the east side, and over the west side, just to help us with our orientation, we've got the city that Google Maps calls Old Trafford. So there's no Manchester, but there is an Old Trafford. And around this, so these cities surround this area of peatland, upland, as do the European brown hares that are in the lowland agricultural fields. High up on the moors, we have got the fluffy white mountain hares. So if you're lucky enough to go on to Bleaklow, I think one day in 365, it might actually be warm, clear and sunny. The rest of the time, it's cold, it's wet, freezing, rain, wind. There's not much there besides peat and heather and cotton grass. But mountain hares, they love it. It's their ideal territory. Now, by contrast, we've got the Peak District lowlands. So here we can see these 4 fields on the left-hand side. They're sort of improved grassland, and they're maintained in this sort of short grassy condition by these other very clever fluffy white creatures called sheep. So sheep sort of contribute to a very short sward and a different kind of landscape as opposed to the upland, acid grassland and heather moorland. And on the lowlands, we have the European brown hares. So that's our notional natural history. But what we'd like to do is measure that a little bit more scientifically. And so to do that, this is where it starts to get a bit more technical, is we gather species data, either from systematic surveys or citizen science data. We also generate pretend data and map that. So pretend absence locations. We gather environmental data from publicly available sources, such as weather data, topography. So we've got this LiDAR sort of concept of a digital elevation model. So it's been scanned by an aircraft, which has flown over sort of wide areas of land and measured the elevation. We've got hydrology data. Satellites give us vegetation types or productivity based on the reflectance of vegetation or bare ground. And we can use aerial images to identify individual kinds of vegetation and human land use. So we've got the species data, we've got the environmental data where the species lives, and then we can start producing these lovely models and maps to predict exactly where animals are. So how are we doing so far? Are we still there, Iona? Is people keeping up?
I'm still here for sure.
Okay, good. As long as I'm coming through loud and clear, that's nice to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. So with citizen science data or systematic survey data, so typically one might say, well, I want your systematic data. I want a scientist that's covered sort of straight lines, for example, these red lines. Then I know I've got complete coverage of an area and that it's thorough. And I also know the effort that the surveyor has gone to. So that's fantastic. For example, here you can see the surveyor has seen, and these are the pink triangles, mountain hare locations in Upper Commons. But the trouble is with this, it is labour intensive, and the whole of the Peak District is about 360 square kilometres. So you couldn't get 1 or 2 guys to survey that. You'd need 4 or 8 people to survey it quite quickly over February and March in a given year. And you might also have the chance that you have a bad weather day and all the hares hide away. So alternatively, you consider using the citizen science data. And this is abundant. So these are records that we've gathered and accumulated at least over 20 years. And you can see that they typically occur where people are walking on the tourists' paths here. So you get lots of detections here. Down in Upper Commons, there are no mountain hare detections. Why is that? It's because the heather is waist deep, it's full of potholes, it's treacherous, no one wants to walk there. So there are literally no citizen science data observations. So you think, again, it's imperfect, maybe a little bit of bias. So we need to think about how we might treat that. What we do is we gather all the data. So this is, for example, from record LRC, and we start to assemble this so that we can map it. This was done for 2001 data onwards. And all we need is, in fact, the easting, the X, and the Y, the northing, to 6 figures to say at that location there was a detection and identification of a mountain hare, maybe how many there were. What we don't necessarily need, which you might think is useful, is was it alive or dead? Well, we're going to say, because all we want to say is, what kind of environment does it live in? What's its range? So we're not bothered whether it was alive or dead. We just assume it died where it used to live. And typically what we also see in these records is some lovely natural history comments, such as, well, I saw it eating heather, or it was playing, or it was molting, and so forth. Now, once we start to accumulate thousands of records, we can't use that information very easily. And also the environmental data we're going to get from maps, or layers as we call them. So all we need is the date and the easting and northing, and to note that the species was identified. And what this then came to over sort of an 18-year period was a very large chunky data set. So if you, in any of these years, at any time in the past, contributed a mountain hare record to Derbyshire Mammal Group or Cheshire Record LRC or whoever, I'd like to say thank you, and thank you very much, because that's formed a vital part of the information for these studies. So how these were used were basically to take each year's data and plot, to start off with, a map of where they were seen. So this is a very small representation of the Peak District, the sort of ovally egg shape. You can see lots of dots here, and it's got this sort of accentuation with the color scheme to say how dense the dots are. 2000, 2001, and so forth. You start to see some fluctuations in the number of detections. And you think, is that an ecological phenomena? So is the population increasing and decreasing from time to time? Or is something else going on? And what's interesting is, you notice here in 2013, the numbers have gone down substantially, the number of records. And so what I'd like to do is offer sort of honor and homage to a gentleman that contributed 30% of the records, of all these records up until 2012, which was the late Derek Yalden, professor from University of Manchester. So 30% of the records up till this time, and the time of his passing in 2013. And then what we have in 2015 is the partnership called Moors for the Future that conduct the Blanket Bog restoration. They launched a citizen science scheme, which they publicized, and hence you get an increase in records and sightings again. So we used all of those records for nearly 20 years for this modeling that we're going to describe. And so you think, well, that's too much. It's going to be biased and accentuated, sort of certain locations where people are walking. So what we did was say, okay, rather than use all these that are clumped together, we'll duplicate them so that there's just one observation per hectare. That's a 100 meter by 100 meter square over 20 years. So we say in this location above Fenny Common, just here, we know once upon a time there's a mountain hare over the past 20 years. And that's all we say. So we're going to measure those environmental characteristics. And so what we achieved was 1,690 records for mountain hares over the past 20 years. These are plotted on this map. So this is again the same representation of the Peak District. So you've got easting here. This is the Ordnance Survey sort of reference, the tick marks. So it's every 10,000 meters. So it's 30 kilometers east to west, 30 kilometers south to north, so a large area. And the red dots are where mountain hares were seen. So just by way of orientation, here's Glossop on the west. Over here is sort of Hathersage on the east and Sheffield. Then what we do is we also generate random absence points. So anywhere where there was not a mountain hare, we generate the same number of records of absence points, which are going to be used for our model. This is going to get more technical, more statistical. So we now have 1,690 absence records as well, which we're going to use. So now then, we start assembling environmental data, which is what we call layer data or raster data. So this is again a representation of the Peak District. This time it's the sort of elevation layer. So the light colors are low, sort of low elevation. The black colors are high, up to 630 meters. So here you can see the familiar shape of Kinder Scout. This is Bleaklow. This is Home Moss. Here is Chew Valley Reservoir, for example. Now, a layer is one data type that's stored. And in fact, while we see the color representations, it's stored as a number. So every pixel, which is 1 hectare, is a number. And we can query the layer at a given location to say, what is the number at that particular point? And so what we then do is look at the environmental characteristics at these locations where we've got records of mountain hares or absences. So for example, we've got a layer which is Bio6. It comes from WorldClim, which is an international sort of projection of weather temperatures over the past 30 years. And this says, let's take this point here, Bleaklow. There was a mountain hare record. In fact, there's tons of mountain hare records at 630 meters, temperature -2. Over here at Back Tor, we've got mountain hares, temperature 0 degrees. Down here, Middle Moor, above Hayfield, elevation roughly 300 meters. Now I can't see the elevation thing on my, here it is. It's 1 degrees, the temperature is 1 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that gives us presence locations with 2 values and an absence location of 1 degrees C. So then we can start doing the same with others. What we're going to do is conduct what's called a logistic regression. So a logistic regression, what this says, here are all the mountain hare locations. So this is what's called the rug at the bottom. And these were the temperature values where we had mountain hare records. So pretty much -2 down to about -1. And then we say, what's the probability of occurrence based on all of these, is that once you're getting above -1 degrees, your probability of occurrence is like 0, so your line is here, whereas at -2 degrees, your probability of occurrence is 0.8, 80%, so pretty high. And it's run this logistic regression line several times according to different selections of the the pretend absence data, but broadly you see this trend. And we can model using this straightforward logistic regression, or we can use more sophisticated means, machine learning and artificial intelligence, or the Maxent algorithm, to come up with a similar formula to say, with that environmental characteristic, is a mountain hare there or not? And so we do it for Bio6, Bio7, all these different kinds of climate variables. So the annual temperature range. So what's the bottom and the top temperature range? What's the mean temperature when it's wettest and when it's driest? How much rainfall is there? And also with topography values. So what's the favored aspect for a mountain hare, which I think from memory is southwest. I think they like to sunbathe. And so we do this for brown hares and mountain hares. So that exercise where we were plotting all the mountain hare records, we've done it also for European brown hares. We see that the mean values the European brown hare favour, the coldest month, minus 1.4. Mountain hare, much colder, minus 1.8. Rainfall, brown hare, 1150 millimetres. But for mountain hare, it's 1400 millimetres. I mean, they're high up on Bleaklow and Kinderscout, and it's just raining all the time up there because it's high up. So that's where the differences are. And so then we predict with these different kinds of statistical models, where they're going to be. So we can use this generalized linear model or the random forest sort of rule set, decision trees, or the maxent. And these are showing probabilities. So the dark green is a higher probability of occurrence. And so because we've got these three different statistical philosophies, and we're not sure which is the best one, we actually take a weighted average of all these statistical tools in order to come up with our predictive models. And that shows that for the mountain hare, we've got this range, the current climate range here that you see in the middle, which is about 170 square kilometers. So you see the mountain hare on Bleaklow, it's at minus 2 degrees and is predicting there. So the computer's predicted it accurately. At Backtor at 530 meters, 0 degrees, has predicted it there. And then the absence location at Middlemore, so just below Kinderscout, there is no prediction of mountain hares. So that green splodge on the Peak District is the mountain hare prediction. It's pretty accurate. And then we say, well, this is the current climate. What about if we use the temperature values for the year 2050? So here in 2020, we're looking at sort of -2 in the winter, but in 30 years' time, it will have increased by up to 4 degrees. So we're looking at temperatures 0 degrees on the tops and in the lowlands up to 2 degrees. Why is that important? It's because it's above the freezing point. So it means no snow. So precipitation here that fell as snow, probably going to fall as rain. And when we use these values, so these warmer values, we get a new prediction for mountain hares. And this is now a much contracted range. So here on Bleaklow, we've still got a prediction of mountain hares at 0 degrees. But here on the east, on Derwent Edges and Backtor, where before we had mountain hares, now the temperature's 2 degrees, these guys, they'll be gone. And down here at Middlemore, they'll still be gone. So there weren't any hares there before, and there's still no hares there now because it's much warmer. That comprises our climate change prediction for mountain hares. So these two species, we've got Lepus timidus, the mountain hare, going from this large range on the uplands to a very small range of just 19 square kilometers. And by contrast, the European brown hare, which occupies the lowland areas where it's warmer, well, it likes warm climates, and as it gets warm higher up on the mountains, we're predicting a range expansion from 252 square kilometers up to in excess of 700 square kilometers, covering the whole of the uplands. Amazing. So what we may see is this is the typical elevation for mountain hares based on those 1690 records. There's a little box plot. This is the mean average line just below 500 meters. It's going to go up to nearly so higher and higher and higher up the mountains until they've got nowhere else to go. And likewise, the European brown hares, they're going to go up from below 300 meters to like 350 meters as their mean elevation. So they'll follow the mountain hares higher up onto the moorland. What a prospect. And so we think about this poor fluffy white bunny. It's got this competitive advantage, this white coat that means that it can keep sort of warm in winter when it's snowy and it's not seen by predators. It can dig through the snow with its furry feet. Those things, absent snow, won't mean anything. So it will just be another hare on the moors, no better, no worse than a European brown hare. So now we then think about the realized niche. You remember we said that we were looking to start off with at the fundamental niche, which was about climate conditions that supports an organism, whether it's the energy from the sunshine and the rainfall. Now we look at the vegetation and the productivity. So we use these vegetation layers, which are expressions of productivity and soil wetness or dryness. And we also use the kinds of vegetation that are there, whether it's berries, cotton grass, heather types, the presence of roads, which is maybe a constraint to hare species. And we see that the European brown hare, they like drier conditions and they like certain types of productive vegetation. The mountain hare, they like less exposed soil, so they like very sort of flourishing vegetation. Now, this gives us slightly different predictions. So the current habitat prediction for mountain hares is pretty broad. And then it's the lowlands for the European brown hare. It's almost a mirror image. It's almost an opposite. So you look at it and think, what's going on here? The temperatures, the rainfall, they're not that much different that they're really going to influence where the animal is. Or is it? Or rather, is it the vegetation type? It's a conundrum. So we look at the predictive map for the brown hare. Most of it is grassland and there's some heather. So here's a nice, cheeky European brown hare on a farm field. By contrast, the mountain hare has been predicted as only being in the sort of heather environments. So you see them in these sort of great big expanses of these carpets of heather. Think, why is this? They're both hares. They both eat this sort of shrubby vegetable matter. What's going on? What's the difference? Interesting question. And this was put to Glenn Ireson, who's still working in Aberdeen at James Hutton Institute, and his colleague. And what they did was an experiment. They captured European brown hares and mountain hares, put them in a zoo in cages, and they fed them with kibble that was sprayed with birch tree resin, sort of sap, to mimic what heather was like as a foodstuff. So they fed it to brown hares and mountain hares. And what they found was that the mountain hare could digest this high resin, woody material quite happily, whereas the European brown hares, they urinated, they experienced sodium loss, and they became sick. They just didn't like it. So we think this is the reason that there is the complete difference in choice of vegetation between these two species. And hence, when you plot their occurrences, the blue is where mountain hares are, the red is where European brown hares are. They're totally different. The black in between is the contact zone. It's measuring like 200 or 300 meters. It's a very narrow overlap, so not much difference. So that's why we think they're in sort of opposite kinds of habitats. So what's going to happen in the future? As it gets warmer, will the heather moorland give way to grass, which does happen when it gets very hot and dry? And if so, we've got a nice white mountain hare here, but are they basically going to turn into European brown hares? And we won't see any mountain hares anymore. And so again, coming back to Thullin from the outset, he describes hybridization between the two species, brown hares outcompeting mountain hares, and he said the mountain hares eventually vanished altogether. So how can we use this information? We think about, do we want to protect certain areas where mountain hares are? Do we want to help the habitat, such as doing the re-wetting of the uplands and the blanket bog restoration? These are the kinds of choices that we can make to try and help these species. So this has all been described in extensive detail in this paper called Splitting Hares. If you type in Google Scholar, Splitting Hares Bedson, you can get this as an open access article. So that concludes the section on ecological niche model using citizen science data, which could not be possible without your help. It's just 5 or 10 minutes on abundance, so it's shorter. Okay, but it's just a lot of fun. So this is a question about how many mountain hares there are. So I used to become quite sensitive. People will say, well, are they in decline? Are they in decline? It's like the high pressure question that you want to answer. So what we did was a couple of things. First of all was a fantastic study on Home Moss in Yorkshire, which is a big hill. We compared different methods for surveying mountain hares. This was published in this paper that you see on the right-hand side. So I worked with a colleague and we conducted daytime sampling, so walking straight line transects to see mountain hares. Now, mountain hare is a nocturnal creature and they hide by day, so you don't get a great deal of detections. So some people say, oh, it's much better to go out at night and survey them. So going out at night, I would use this sort of thermal imager, this sort of military equipment, and that could see the heat signature from a mountain hare for a distance, even out to like 1,800 meters. So amazing. You can see mountain hares scampering about. It's dark. They think no one can see them. They have a bit of a play with each other. They fool around. They're eating and foraging. You get to see their natural behavior. You see a lot more hares. Now, the other study that we did was using camera traps. So people are familiar with these. We might put them in our garden or on trails. We put them on grids on the top of Home Moss of up to 16 cameras spaced out, sort of, I think there were 330 meters apart in grids for a month at a time, and moved them around. And that got good detections of mountain hares. And so we're able to compare the sort of intensity of the detections by each method and say they were broadly matching, not entirely, but broadly matching. But what this survey also did was showed the detection probability, which is what's the chance of seeing a mountain hare by day versus by night, using either a thermal imager or camera traps. And by comparing those probabilities, you can come up with a density estimate. And that showed that there's actually no advantage to surveying at night versus at day. So at daytime, I know I can see 1 in 5 mountain hares out to a range of about 500 meters. Whereas by night, with the thermal imager, I know I can see about 1 in 3 mountain hares out to a range of about 300 meters or so. So I'm seeing more. However, I'm missing sort of 70%, whereas by day, 70%. By daytime, I'm missing more, 80%. But I can compare these probabilities, so to get like-for-like density estimates. So those were the comparison of survey methods that gave us a lot of confidence in that daytime surveys were good. So I'll describe that a little bit further. So then we had another paper produced, which was comparing mountain hare densities on different kinds of habitat types, so the blanket bog and the grouse moorland. And this used in detail sort of survey regimen across Bleaklow and also across Derwent Edges. So these thick black lines were covered as transect, the same transects for 5 years. We're now into our 7th year using this method. And this gives an estimate in this area of about 30 square kilometers, and here 30 square kilometers. So it's very comprehensive and thorough. And what it does is it uses distance sampling, which basically means you walk a transect line and you use a laser rangefinder to measure the distance to the object, and you use a compass to figure out the angle, so you can use trigonometry to get the distance of the object to that transect line. And it has a formula which says, sort of a principle that says, if the object is literally on a transect line, you've got a 100% chance of seeing it. But if it's, say, 500 meters away, maybe you've just got a 5 or 10% chance of seeing it. So it models the decreasing probability of seeing the animal as according to the distance that you've measured to that animal. And then it has a formula that takes that detection probability and multiplies that by the area surveyed, and that's divided into the number of times you see the animal times the average group size. I know I'm throwing lots of numbers at you. It comes to a density estimate. It's an internally consistent formula. There's no sort of regressions or sort of statistical jiggery-pokery. It's a maths formula, so it's pretty good. And so what that does is it gives you this detection probability here. You can see at 0 meters, I'm seeing 100% of the hares. At 100 meters, I'm seeing like 30% of the hares. That's pretty good. By daytime, I see 1 in 3 hares to 100 meters. That's pretty good. Out to about 500 meters. And the statistics are strong, so it's a very good sort of, this is on the probability model. It's sort of a high fit. So this line is pretty reliable. And then the maths that support it, so that's the encounter rate and the number of encounters and the group size and the area contributes to the density estimate. So on Bleaklow, typically in 2019, when we surveyed the whole of the Peak District, see about 27 mountain hares per square kilometre, less on Marjorie Hill, far less on Home Moss and on the edge areas. So that came out with an abundance, so total area times density, for about 3,500 mountain hares. And the density on the main surveyed areas, it went up in 2018 a lot, saw tons of mountain hares, and then started to decline and settle in 2021. The raw count data for 2022 dropped substantially. I still haven't done the stats on that yet. It's upstairs and I need to do it, and I'm surveying this year. So that's work to be done. So that's the density estimates for mountain hares for the Peak District. So that's how we calculated abundance. So I'm now going to, one other thing is, by doing, the wonderful thing about doing repeat transects is you start to build up a picture of expectation for where we might see mountain hares or not. So like 2019, tons of mountain hares in this location, but not in 2020, not in 2021, but I've walked the same transect. So you sort of think, what's going on? Why is it different? Maybe it's just a fluke, but when you do sort of 26 squares, 1 kilometer squares, you build up a sort of a pretty intensive picture. So that's the abundance studies. Finally, talk about conservation status briefly. So mountain hares across the Northern Hemisphere are regarded as not a problem. There's lots in Italy, in Switzerland, there's still some in Sweden, there's still some in Russia. But in the UK, they're regarded as a biodiversity action plan species. The numbers in Scotland were recorded to have dropped by 2/3 over about a 20-year period because of the extensive culling that had taken place in the sort of in the noughties and the 2010s. And so then also we've got questions about the persistence in England. They're recommended to be added to Schedule 5 of the 1981 Wildlife and Countryside Act, which is a legal question that's in progress at the moment with the parliamentary processes. We've got a range, max range 360 square kilometers. but based on climate values, 168 square kilometers going down to 20 square kilometers in the year 2030. And a population of 3,500 individuals might sound like a lot, but scientists, these people that came up with island biogeography, Michael Soule and so forth, they say that you need about 4,000 herbivores to keep them going. Otherwise, there's a risk of extinction. And so what's threats to mountain hares? Well, these are sort of generally sort of sound population dynamic factors. We've got things like the genetic diversity might be a problem because they've just come from the Scottish stock, which we know went through a bottleneck. Mountain hares suffer an intestinal parasite, which sort of balloons in numbers every few years, causes the female mountain hares to go sick and the population crashes. Then they may be predated by foxes and stoats and weasels and buzzards. Maybe food sources are a problem. Should have put weather here, extreme weather events here as well. Disease can rip through hare populations quickly. Competition by European brown hares, I mean, it goes on and on and on. And then there's these human beings that can do hunting and coursing and roadkill, which are indiscriminate. We cannot detect the gender of a mountain hare or whether it's a young or an old one by sight. So these are indiscriminate sort of lethal threats, and they're additive to the natural mortality. So lots of threats, population below viable population thresholds, hopefully gets some legal protection. So that concludes the presentation. I once again would like to say thank you for records that you've submitted or that you may submit in the future. Whether it's for mountain hares or other species, there are plenty of scientists that are interested in this. If you want to know more about these studies, go to Manchester University eSpace and you can download this lovely thesis of 300 pages, which has got some nice photographs in as well. But the statistical maps and charts are just out of this world. So I appreciate your patience with the technical glitch at the outset, and I appreciate your time this evening.